In 2008, construction workers were renovating a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps. Beneath the floorboards, they found a sealed wooden vault. Inside it were 4 garments wrapped in linen. Each one had separate cups stitched from fabric, shoulder straps, and lacing at the back. They looked unmistakably like bras. They were 500 years old. That discovery cracked open a very confident chapter of fashion history. For more than a century, the accepted story went like this. Women endured corsets for 350 years, and then a handful of inventors in the late 1800s finally freed them with the modern bra. Neat, simple, wrong. The real history is messier, stranger, and far more interesting. It begins thousands of years before that Austrian castle, and it ends not with liberation, but with a question that every generation of women has answered differently. What should a woman's body look like? Who actually gets to decide? That question drove women across very different civilizations to make very different choices. In one ancient culture, they wore tight-fitted bodices that lifted the bust and left it completely uncovered. In another, they bound their chests flat with strips of linen. In Europe, they laced themselves into constructions reinforced with whalebone, wood, and eventually steel. These were garments that left visible marks on their bones. Then they invented their way out of it. One woman in a Paris workshop, one woman with a metal plate and a patent application, one woman who figured out that women's bodies did not all have the same shape. Every century called its solution the natural one, the correct one, the civilized one. Every solution was eventually replaced. This is the full story. From the first fitted bodice in the ancient world, through 4 centuries of one of the most physically damaging garments in European history, through reform movements and patent battles, to the standardized cup sizes that turned a single undergarment into a global industry. The story begins with a figurine, small enough to hold in one hand, painted in bright colors, uncomfortable enough that every Victorian archaeologist who wrote about it had to think very carefully about which words to use. What it reveals about women's clothing 3,000 years ago, and about who has always defined how women's bodies are supposed to look, historians genuinely did not see coming. By the end of this, you will understand why the corset survived every attempt to kill it for 4 centuries, and what finally finished it off. The figurine that started this story came from the island of Crete. Archaeologists found it in the ruins of a palace complex they spent decades excavating. It was made of painted faience, a glazed ceramic material. It stood roughly 30 centimeters tall. The figure wore an elaborate layered skirt. Her bodice was tight, fitted, and structured. Her bust was fully exposed. She was not alone. Dozens of similar figures came from the same site. Frescoes on the palace walls showed women in the same style, moving through ceremonial spaces, facing forward. The civilization was Minoan. The dating puts these images at roughly 3,600 years ago. That number matters. They show structured breast support, lifting and shaping fabric, fitted close to the body. They predate the Christian era by more than 1,500 years. Fresco fragments from the same site show these bodices in color. The fabric appears layered, cut close at the waist, structured enough to hold its shape without the wearer adjusting it. That level of construction implies a working knowledge of pattern making and tailoring. Picture a craftsperson in a Minoan workshop, cutting and fitting fabric to a precise human form. The bodice had to keep its structure through movement, through ceremony, through whatever the wearer needed. That required careful cutting and close fitting to the body. It was not a simple cloth folded and tied. The exposure of the bust was not accidental and not private. The style appears consistently in ritual and ceremonial contexts. Scholars connect it to fertility, to the divine feminine, to status in Minoan society. The women depicted in this style were not ordinary figures going about ordinary work. What the garment communicated was not vulnerability. The exposed bust was a signal within a social and ritual order, not submission to an outside gaze. Here is what the figurines cannot tell us: whether every Minoan woman dressed this way, or only certain women in certain contexts. The images we have are almost entirely ceremonial. They may represent religious roles, elite status, or specific ritual moments. The daily clothing of a woman working outside the palace is simply not documented. This is the limit of the evidence. We can see what the garment looked like. We can see it was structured and deliberate. What we cannot confirm is how widespread it was beyond the ceremonial record. The Minoan bodice is the earliest known evidence of structured breast support in the ancient Mediterranean. It does not look like compression. It does not look like concealment. It looks like the opposite. That would change, and it would change fast. The shift happened gradually, over several centuries. But when the Greeks began recording women's dress in art and writing, the logic had reversed almost entirely. Where Minoan fashion lifted and displayed the bust as a mark of ritual standing, Greek fashion moved in the opposite direction. It compressed, it flattened, it concealed. The garment was simple in construction. A long strip of wool or linen, sometimes as wide as a hand. It wrapped tightly around the chest and tied in place. The Greeks called it the apodesmos, a word meaning binding. Some texts use strophion instead. Both names, one function: draw the breasts flat against the body and hold them there. Picture a woman in a classical Athenian household preparing for the day. She takes the band and begins at one side. She wraps it across her chest, layer by layer. The tension builds until it sits even across the full surface. The loose draped chiton falls over all of it from the shoulders. Nothing of the apodesmos is visible. That was the point. Greek vase paintings occasionally show women caught mid-dress. The apodesmos appears as a horizontal band across the torso, visible before the outer chiton covers it. The fit was close. The wrapping was systematic. Wool held tension differently than linen. A wool band stretched slightly under pressure and conformed to the body. Linen was stiffer, held its shape longer, and washed more easily. Women chose based on availability and the time of year. The word strophion appears in Athenian comic drama of the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. Poets and playwrights used it without definition, the way you mention something so routine it needs no explanation. The garment required no introduction. It was simply what women wore. The cultural logic behind the shift is harder to establish precisely. Greek aesthetic philosophy valued restraint, proportion, and bodily discipline. A smooth, contained silhouette under draped fabric, aligned with ideas about feminine virtue and control. The Minoan logic of ceremonial display had no clear equivalent in this framework. Greek women of citizen class moved through a more restricted social world. What was visible in public mattered. What was controlled mattered more. The apodesmos was cheap and easy to make. Any household with access to basic cloth could produce one. A woman of modest means and a merchant's wife wore the same garment. Only the quality of the fiber differed. That simplicity was also its structural limit. A wrapped band held the bust flat, but it distributed no weight and provided no shaped support. For daily domestic movement, it functioned well enough. For anything more physically demanding, it offered little. The Romans inherited the Greek solution almost unchanged, but they added one element that changed how it performed under physical strain. The Romans called the wrapped band a strophium. In function, it matched the Greek apodesmos almost exactly. A strip of linen or soft wool, wound tight across the chest and tied in place. The fit left no gap, no loose fold. For ordinary life in a Roman household or marketplace, the strophium worked the same way it had for Greek women. It held the breasts flat, kept the outer garment smooth, and required nothing complicated to produce or maintain. Most women owned several. The material was cheap. But Roman women who exercised faced a different problem. A wrapped band stays in place while the body is still. Under sustained movement, the layers shift. The tension loosens or migrates upward. What holds securely at the start of an activity becomes unreliable within the hour. This is the element the Romans added. Not a new material, not a different philosophy, a different method of attachment. In the 4th century of the Common Era, artists decorating a private estate on the island of Sicily captured what women actually wore during athletic competition. The mosaic covered a long corridor of the main hall. It showed women running, throwing, and competing for prizes. One figure holds a palm branch. This was the standard mark of athletic victory used throughout the Greek and Roman world. Whoever designed this mosaic understood the conventions of competitive sport. The women shown were not exercising casually. They were competing. The estate is known today as Villa Romana del Casale. The mosaic survived under landslide debris for many centuries before excavation in the 20th century brought it into view. It is one of the most detailed surviving records of Roman women's athletic dress. The garments shown are not wrapped strips. Each figure wears 2 separate fitted pieces, one at the hips and one across the bust. Each is tied at the sides. The upper band holds against the body without relying on wound-up tension to stay there. Picture a woman preparing for the exercise yard. She ties the upper band before entering. The knot sits at her side. As she runs, the band holds its position. It does not climb. It does not shift. That difference becomes visible the moment the body accelerates. A layer wound for compression loosens through friction. A tied and fitted piece stays put because of how it closes, not because of how tightly it was wound. Roman writers also referred to a second garment called the mamellare, distinct from the ordinary strophium. The precise construction is not preserved in surviving texts, but the separate vocabulary is significant. Romans named things that functioned differently. 2 words, 2 garments. This distinction between everyday compression and support built for movement would not reappear in surviving physical evidence for roughly 1,000 years. While the Mediterranean world wrapped and tied its bands of linen, women on the other side of the world were solving the same problem with different materials and different logic. In ancient India, stone reliefs carved across the subcontinent left records that textiles cannot. Many show women wearing a fitted band across the chest, held close to the body. Covering, but not compressing. This was not the same solution as the Greek apodesmos. The Greek band aimed to flatten. The Indian garment aimed to contain without suppressing volume. Sanskrit texts from the classical period name the kanchuka, a fitted bodice worn by women of status. It was made from cotton or silk, cut to shape, and laced or tied at the side. Some sources place it in court dress. Others connect it to performers, who needed freedom of movement while keeping a defined silhouette. The body in motion requires a different solution than the body at rest. This pattern appears independently across cultures separated by thousands of miles. In China, the garment was called the dudu. Its construction was specific, a square or diamond-shaped panel of fabric, usually silk or cotton, placed flat against the front of the torso. 2 strings looped around the neck, 2 more tied at the back. The panel held its position through those 4 attachment points alone. No winding, no layered tension. The dudu was an undergarment, invisible beneath the outer robe. But it was not made carelessly. Surviving examples from the Ming and Qing dynasties show embroidered surfaces, flowers, fish, birds worked into the fabric with colored thread. Women decorated the garment no one else was meant to see. Picture a woman in a Ming period household tying the neck strings before pulling on her outer robe. The embroidery faces inward, toward her own skin. From outside, the robe shows nothing. The smooth, flat silhouette visible in public was not the result of pressure applied to the body. It came from cut, layering, and how the outer fabric draped over the dudu's surface. No rigid structure, no compression. The functional goal, a clean layer between skin and cloth, a defined shape beneath the outer garment, was recognizable from Rome to India to China. The methods were entirely different. None of this knowledge moved between continents. The kanchika and the dudu developed without contact with Mediterranean tradition. The solutions stayed contained within their own textile cultures and trade networks. What connects them is not shared invention. It is a shared constraint. Wherever women wore layered clothing, something had to sit between the body and the outer layer. What that layer was made from, how it was attached, what shape it was supposed to create, those answers were worked out locally. By what materials could be sourced, by what each culture had decided the female form should look like in public. What happened to that knowledge in Europe between the ancient world and the 19th century was, for most of the 20th century, a blank. Historians operated on a simple assumption. The modern bra was invented in the 1800s. Before that, European women had nothing, just wrapped linen, layered shifts, and eventually the corset. That assumption lasted for decades. It appeared in fashion history courses, in encyclopedias, in museum labels. It seemed safe because no physical evidence had survived to contradict it. Textiles decay, linen rots, cotton unravels. What women wore closest to their skin rarely survived long enough to be catalogued. Then, in 2008, workers renovating Lengberg Castle in the Tyrol region of Austria broke through a sealed vault beneath the floorboards of a 15th century room. Inside were hundreds of fragments of clothing and textiles. The sealed space had protected the fabric from moisture and air for centuries. Among the pieces were 4 linen garments, unlike anything previously catalogued from that period. 2 of them had cups, sewn separately, shaped to hold each breast independently, with straps that ran over the shoulders. Researchers from the University of Innsbruck analyzed the finds. Radiocarbon dating placed the garments between roughly 1400 and 1470 Dals, the middle of the 15th century, more than 400 years before the bra was supposed to exist. Picture a tailor in a Tyrolean household cutting 2 ovals of linen, stitching them into cups, attaching them to a fitted band. The design logic is identical to what would later be celebrated as invention. The difference is that nobody recorded this tailor's name. Nobody patented the design. The Lengberg garments were not crude prototypes. They showed clear evidence of wear. The stitching had been repaired more than once. Someone wore these garments regularly. She washed them. She fixed them when they frayed. Then they ended up beneath a floorboard, sealed and forgotten for 5 centuries. The discovery shifted the entire timeline. If structured breast support existed in the 1400s, with separate cups, shoulder straps, and a fitted band, then the 19th century inventors were not creating something new. They were recreating something that had been lost. The question immediately became, how widespread was this? Was Lengberg an exception, a regional solution that never spread? Or was this a common garment that simply did not survive? Historians do not have a clean answer yet. What the Lengberg garments proved is that absence of evidence had been read as evidence of absence, and that was wrong. The assumption that structured breast support began with the industrial age turned out to be an artifact of what decayed and what survived. The Lengberg garments showed what was possible. A fitted support, worn close to the body, shaped to the wearer. But they also showed what was coming, because within a generation of those Austrian bodices, a completely different philosophy arrived in Europe, and it would not leave for nearly 400 years. The year was 1533. A 14-year-old girl from Florence named Catherine de Medici sailed to France to marry the future king. She brought with her Italian silk, Italian cooks, and something that would reshape, literally, the bodies of European women for centuries. She brought the rigid body, not a garment for support, a garment for control. The device Catherine introduced was built on a central principle. The human torso, left to its natural shape, was wrong. It needed to be corrected. The ribs pulled in, the waist narrowed to a point, the chest pushed upward and forward into a smooth, shelf-like form. Imagine a workshop in Paris or Lyon in the 1540s. A seamstress layers 2 panels of thick linen. She channels strips of whalebone, the flexible plates from the jaw of a bowhead whale, through narrow slots stitched into the fabric. Down the center, a flat busk of polished wood or ivory. The whole structure is laced at the back with a long cord, tightened incrementally, inch by inch. The finished garment weighed several pounds. It could not be put on alone. A woman needed at minimum 1 other person to dress her. The tightening was not done in a single day. Young women in noble households were eased into progressively smaller measurements over months, sometimes years. The body, the bones, the soft tissue, the organs, adapted slowly to accommodate the new shape. Catherine reportedly set a standard at the French court. No woman with a waist larger than 13 inches was welcome at formal events. Historians disagree about whether this rule was ever enforced or whether it was more legend than policy. But the measurement circulated. It spread, and courts across Europe began to use the waist as a visible marker of discipline and status. What the corset replaced was not nothing. It replaced the earlier tradition of flexible breast support, the laced bodice, the fitted shift, the cup-shaped linen structures found at places like Lengberg. Those garments had shaped without constraining. The corset did something fundamentally different. It treated the entire torso as material to be remade. Within decades, the garment had spread far beyond royal courts. Merchants' wives wore them. Craftswomen wore them. By the 1600s, even working women in urban households had some version of stays, a simpler, cheaper construction, with fewer whalebone channels and cruder stitching, but built on the same principle. The market for whalebone grew. Ships out of the North Atlantic brought back baleen by the shipload, specifically for the stay-making trade. The garment had become an industry. What nobody calculated, or perhaps nobody admitted, was the physical cost. Not just discomfort. Sustained compressive pressure on the ribs and organs, worn for years, left marks that were not temporary. That cost would not be reckoned with for another 3 centuries. 3 centuries of pressure produced a breaking point. By the 1880s, physicians had begun publishing evidence they could no longer ignore. Autopsies of women who had worn corsets for decades showed ribs angled inward at permanent angles, livers displaced from their natural position, lungs with measurably reduced capacity compared to women who had worn looser garments. Elizabeth Stuart Phelps Ward, an American writer, published a pamphlet in 1873 with a straightforward argument. The corset was not a fashion choice, it was a medical problem. She called for its abolition in plain terms. The dress reform movement that followed was not immediately successful. Fashion changes slowly, particularly when it is tied to ideas of status and respectability. But the argument was now in print, and it did not go away. Then came the war. In 1917, the United States War Industries Board asked women to stop buying steel-boned corsets. The metal was needed for military equipment. American women responded, and in doing so, freed up enough steel to build 2 battleships. What replaced corsets was not nothing. Women still needed support. And in 1910, a 22-year-old from New York named Mary Phelps, Jacob had already solved the problem without intending to. She had a sheer evening gown. Her corset showed through. In her bedroom, with a maid's help, she tied 2 silk handkerchiefs together with pink ribbon, slipped it over her shoulders, and went to the party. Other women at the event asked what she was wearing. Jacob patented the design in 1914 and called it the backless brassiere. She sold the patent 4 years later for $1,500, a transaction she later described as one of the great mistakes of her life. The company that bought it eventually earned millions. Ida Rosenthal understood the market differently. In the 1920s, her company Maidenform introduced the first standardized cup sizing, separating women by measurement rather than treating all bodies as interchangeable. A, B, C, D. The bra became something that could be fitted, not just purchased. By mid-century, the garment had been industrialized, politicized, and mythologized. The 1960s brought protesters to the Miss America pageant with trash cans they called freedom bins, corsets, girdles, and bras thrown in together as symbols of the same pressure, updated for a new era. Actual burning was rare. The myth proved more durable than the fact. And somewhere in the history of all of this, from the Minoan snake goddess with her open bodice and her snakes, to the French court and its 13-inch ideal, to Mary Phelps Jacob and 2 handkerchiefs, one thing remains constant. Every generation believed it had finally gotten the relationship between a woman's body and what covered it exactly right. Every generation was eventually replaced. The snake goddess has been standing in that Crete museum for over a century now, uncorseted, unbothered, holding her snakes.